This is the second, or just the other, of two videotapes of Dr. Franklin A. Graybill being made as part of the ASA program of filming distinguished statisticians. On the other tape, which was actually made first, Frank Graybill gave a presentation on confidence bounds for functions of components of variance. This videotape consists of a discussion that Frank held with 5 of his former PhD students here at Colorado State. And I'd like to introduce the participants. First, about as near to the center of the table as you can get with 6 people, Frank being just a little bit to the right, is Frank Graybill. He's looking particularly relaxed, not realizing what he's in for. On his right is Dr. Jack Wang, and to his right then is Dallas Johnson. On Frank's left is Kazimpur, and then Bill Owen and Nati Ting. I think they have agreed that Nati Ting will ask the first question of Frank.
Dr. Graybill, I would like to have you share with us how did you get into statistics, and eventually how did you go to academia and choose teaching as a profession? Will you go over a little bit of that for us?
I was born and grew up in the rolling hill country of southwestern Iowa, and during the 1930s we were very poor, didn't have much money or anything, and didn't even know if I'd get to go to college. We didn't have a car, but one time I remember when I was, I don't know, about 12 years old, I guess, my uncle came and took my mother and me down to visit her mother, my grandmother. And on the way down, we stopped at a town, Tabor, Iowa, which had a big park, and they had a small college there. And my mother had fixed a lunch, and we were eating in the park. The reason I remember so much detail, I remember it, and then she and I have talked about this over the years several times. We stopped in the park to have lunch, and in this park there were some concrete benches. And while we were eating lunch there, I noticed this guy came and sat down on the bench for a little while. He had kind of a gray beard. Then he'd get up and he'd put his hands behind him and he walked around a little bit, and then he'd go back and sit down. And I said to my mother, who's he? What does he do? And she said, I suppose he teaches at this college here. And right then I knew I wanted to be a college professor. I could put my hands behind my back and walk around in the park. I didn't realize I had to run into Washington every few weeks and things like that, but I really did. And in my high school yearbook, some of my fellow students reminded me when I went back to my 50th graduation a couple of years ago that I had said I wanted to be a high school teacher and do research. Well, I didn't know. I wanted to write books. It's written down in the yearbook there, or kind of a yearbook thing we had. So that's how I really did always want to be a college professor, a teacher. And when I graduated, I didn't have money or anything. My parents didn't have money to go to college, and I didn't know what I was going to do. In this same little town of Tabor at that time, a friend of mine told me that they had started a junior college there 2 years before, and that you could come down and work for everything, your board and room, tuition, everything. And in addition, they gave you $10 a month. So I tried to get enrolled there, and I did. I got accepted, and so I went 2 years to college there. Do you want me to go on with the story?
Sure.
Then after that, I had a coach in high school that came from William Penn College in Oskaloosa, Iowa, and he said to me, he said, if you ever need some help going to college, let me know. And when I graduated in this 2-year college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, except I knew, where I wanted to go, but I knew I wanted to go to college. So I wrote him, and he said, well, he could get me a job in August to work for my tuition. And then a friend of mine was going there, and so he got me a place to stay, and I got a job at a restaurant to work for my meals. And so I went to Oskaloosa That was the fall of 1941. William Penn College, a Quaker college, and they were quite good to me. And in December 7th, 1941, everybody knows what's happened, the Pearl Harbor. And when I went home Christmas vacation, I was all gung-ho, so I went down and enrolled in the Army Air Cadets. I wanted to go fight. And so I went back Christmas, spring vacation in March and asked him when they were going to take me. And he said, well, we'll take you right away. So I went back and quit school in the middle of the semester. Went back home. They didn't take me for 6 months. So I lost a semester of college. So I went to the Air Force and spent 3 or 4 years. I've forgotten exactly how long I spent in the Air Force. I mean, in the service. And then when I came back, I did go to William Penn College and finish. And then I saw advertising on the bulletin board. They needed graduate teaching assistants in the Department of Mathematics at Oklahoma State University, then called Oklahoma A&M. So at the end of May, I got married. I married Jean, and went to Oklahoma and spent 2 years working on a master's degree in mathematics. Didn't have much mathematics, never even had a course in differential equations, but they called it a master's degree in mathematics. We got down there, and I was a little late, and we all had to go in, all the new graduate assistants and the graduate students had to go in and see the department head. And so went down. There were quite a few of us right after the war. A lot of graduate students did the teaching because they had an influx of GIs after the war going to college. And we're all sitting kind of out in the anteroom on benches and waiting to see the department head, and I was scared to death. I was a kid from a town of 600, and I didn't know what I was doing there. And somebody came up to a guy who was sitting beside me and said, "What are you going to major in?" He said, "I'm going to major in actuarial science." So talked a little while, and pretty soon it was my turn to go in, and went in. The department head said, "What do you want to major in?" I said, "I want to major in actuarial science." I kind of knew what it was, but I didn't know what else to say. And so he said, "Well, you need to go over and take a course in statistics." And I think there they had 2 courses out of Snedeker and 2 courses out of Hull's kind of elementary theoretical statistics. So I took the 4 courses in statistics there, got a master's degree in mathematics. Didn't take a whole lot of mathematics. And then Carl Marshall was the person that took me under his wing there, and I owe Carl a great debt. He was the one that told me I probably ought to try to go to Iowa State and get a PhD in statistics. So he helped me get into Iowa State, actually. And so I went to Iowa State, and I knew by then I wanted to teach in university. And so I went to Iowa State and got my PhD under Professor Kempthorne. And then Carl Marshall asked me to come back on the faculty at Oklahoma A&M, so I went back and spent 8 years there. That's kind of my history before I came to Colorado State University in 1960. So I guess I'd always wanted to be a college professor, and I never really ever considered seriously doing anything else.
You mentioned Professor Kempthorne. Of course, we've all heard so much about him. I wonder if you have any interesting stories you could tell us about your acquaintance with him.
Well, I owe a lot to Professor Kempthorne. He was a hard taskmaster, but he taught me a lot. I owe him a great deal. I can tell you about the first time I ever met Professor Kempthorne. I went up to Iowa State, and I was teaching. They didn't have any fellowships for me in the stat department or stat lab, so I went over to, Carl Marshall got me a graduate assistantship in the math department. And I was teaching some elementary mathematics, but I went up to major in statistics. So I went over to the statistics department shortly after I got up there, for a week or 2 before classes started. I've forgotten the details. And I went in to the department head. The department head had just resigned or retired or something. And so somebody said, well, you ought to go in and probably see Professor Kempthorne. So I remember walking in. I will forget this. I think I've told him about this. I walked into office Professor Kempthorne, and I said, I want to major in statistics. And I remember him saying, well, where'd you come from? And I told him. And I remember him getting up and putting his hands behind his back and walking around the room a little bit. And then he turned around and he said, I'll quiz you. So there I was, standing shaking my boots, and he looked at me and he said, "Frank Graybill, from Oklahoma A&M." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "What's a Banach space?" Well, I didn't know what a Banach space was. That was long before the space shots and things like that. But anyway, I said, "I don't know." I remember this conversation. I was scared to death. So then he asked me another question about something that I did know, and so anyway, I enrolled, and then the second year I was there, I taught in the Department of Statistics. And the second year, I think it was the second year, Professor Kempthorne asked me to come in and office with him. And I was in there, and one day, and I thought, well, I should quiz Professor Kempthorne, I guess I thought I should do. So one day I said to Professor Kempthorne, I was sitting there, and I remember this very well, I said, "Professor Kempthorne, what's a Banach space?" He looked up at me and said, "Oh, hell," he said, "I don't know." But I graduated then under Professor Kempthorne in 1952 and went back to Oklahoma State and stayed until 1960 when I came to Colorado State University. So that's sort of my history at Iowa State. Incidentally, I might add this. When I went to Iowa State, Cox had been there, Gertrude Cox, Professor Cochran, Mood had been there, Brown had been there, and they had just recently left before I got there. And Cox, of course, had gone to North Carolina to start a statistics group. I think Mood had gone into industry, and Brown, I think, had left a year or two before that. And I took a course in theoretical statistics. First course I took in theoretical statistics there, and Bernie Austell taught it, and he taught it out of Mood's notes, of Mood's book. I was there. And of course, Snedeker was there, George Snedeker, fine gentleman. He had just retired and was professor emeritus, and he'd come around the lab once in a while where we had our offices and talk to us. And Bancroft, second year I was there, Ted Bancroft became chairman and was chairman for many, many years at Iowa State University.
Very well, you have mentioned the Mood and the notes of Mood, and you are very well known in the linear models and also your book in matrices. But we have heard so much story about Mood, Graybill, and Bayes, and it is known that, or I have heard that you have not met Mood at all when you rewrote the book. Is that right? Or?
As far as I know, I've never met Alex Mood. I thought that he asked Professor Holmeyer, who was professor at Iowa State University when I was there, who Mood knew well, because Mood was there on the faculty too. But I guess that what happened was McGraw-Hill approached me and asked me if I would like to revise Mood's book. Mood was too busy. He had formed his own company at that time. But as far as I know, I have never met Alex Mood. If I did, I met him briefly at a meeting or something. And then time for the third edition, I asked one of my colleagues, Dwayne Bayes, if he would rewrite the book, and Alex and he and I agreed, and Dwayne. So the third edition is really Dr. Bayes' book. He did practically all of it.
Did Dr. Bayes met Mood, or Alex Mood?
As far as I know, I don't think Dr. Bayes ever met him either. So he hasn't met Mood, and I haven't met Mood, but Dwayne Bayes and I, we've met each other.
Who signs the checks?
Yeah, he signs the checks.
Frank, I have a story. I think we all have a lot of affection for Frank. It's genuine in spite of what may come out on the camera today. But I was a senior math major during Dr. Graybill's first year, and I was in ROTC, and I was taking abstract algebra and analysis, and I hated pure mathematics. And I was going to be an airborne ranger and go after people with bayonets. I couldn't think of anything else to do. And then I had my first course out of what was at the time was just plain Mood with Dr. Graybill, and it totally changed my life. And of course I've gone into teaching too. my students would very much like to get even with you for that now. I would like to ask you a serious question, though, and if you were giving advice to a young statistician, say, who was going out onto his first teaching job and was teaching to a class that would have one and only one exposure to statistics, not mathematics majors, how would you approach the topic of confidence intervals versus hypothesis testing?
Well, as all my students know, I think confidence intervals is a much more and much better procedure. In fact, I think hypothesis testing is a lost cause. But and confidence intervals are, I would say, uniformly more informative than hypothesis testing. I don't know about the teaching one course. I found when I was consulting that investigators that had used hypothesis testing, been taught it and used it, they liked it because they didn't have to think as much, I believe. You ask them if it was easy for them to say, well, I want to accept or reject something. But then on their own, I think a lot of them would investigate this a little bit further. But when you give them confidence intervals, as we all know, then that puts a little more of the pressure on them to make the final decision of whether, if we're testing, say, the difference of two treatments or something like that. Rather than say, are these two treatments different or are they not different or are they different? If you set a confidence interval, then this tells us, at least with a certain confidence, what the difference is, and then they have to make the decision. I think if I were, I say this with a little tongue-in-cheek, I think if I were teaching a course and they were only going to take one, I might leave out hypothesis testing altogether. On the other hand, it's part of our culture, and if you don't include it, they're going to see it so much if they use statistics at all, they're going to see it so much, they're going to wonder about it. So I guess we've got to teach it. So I presume that I think at our best, maybe we should teach it and then try to caution our students to use it very sparingly or not use it at all. But that it is part of the culture and part of the statistics, and that we need to be careful of it.
Let me change the subject. You were the president of the American Statistical Association in bicentennial year 1976. Could you say more about your involvement with ASA and?
Well, the thing I remember most about ASA was the party we had, and I think it's after the presidential address in 1976. Our faculty and we invited all our former students and had a nice party. I remember that quite well, partly because I got to see a lot of my former students. I was involved with ASA on several committees, different times. One thing we did try to do when I was president, Fred Leone was executive director, we tried to get some of the congressional people to be a little more aware of what statistics was and how important statistics had to be to policy making in the government. And I remember we thought Pat Schroeder would be a good person, the congresswoman from Colorado, would be a good person to see. And since I was from Colorado, I called and asked if we could get an appointment with her. And she very graciously said yes. And so Fred Leone and I forget who else it was, and I went in and we tried to impress her how important statistics was if they were going to begin making policy about the environment, policy about medical. They ought to know before they make policy decisions. They ought to know what the facts are. So that's kind of my involvement with ASA. Actually, I had been chairman of the education section and something like that for several years earlier.
You also was the editor for biometric for several years.
I was editor for biometric for a term, served as editor. Being an editor is a big job. It was really a big job. I had some good associate editors, which really helps if you have good associate editors. One thing I did do as editor, which I'm quite proud of, George Snedeker had died. And about 2 or 3 years before this, or maybe longer than that, I've forgotten, George Snedeker was in Florida. That's where I don't know whether he retired there permanently. When I went as a student to Iowa State, George Snedeker was professor emeritus, but he was around the lab. But I think he was living, no, I think it was California. I think it was San Diego, California he was living. And one day I saw something came across my desk. George Snedeker had sent his dues in or something, sent it to the wrong place, sent it to me. And I found out where he was, so I wrote him a letter. And he wrote me back a very nice long letter and tell me about, he was 90-some years old then, tell me about how difficult it was now that he was getting older and didn't remember things as well, but he did remember me, or said he did. And he died in either before or while I think it was during my editorship, and so I was able to get out a special edition of Biometrics Journal to honor George Snedeker, who of course everybody knows is one of the real giants in statistics, at least getting statistics used by agriculture and biologists.
One of the things that all of us that were students of yours that have drawn on throughout the years is your extraordinary enthusiasm for the subject and for your work ethics and everything. And I think that the relationship that you have with students and the way that you treat students and the way that you work with students probably would be nice to have people hear that, because all of us have to work with students, and sometimes we don't like our students that we're working with. And if you ever had a student you didn't like, I guess I'm not clear who that might be or why that might be, but just basically I guess what I'm interested in is how do you view your relationships with students and when you work with them on dissertations and so on?
I had one student I hated. I'm going to tell you who that is. I never had a student I didn't like, actually, and I took several students as PhD students, and I think that's probably my most enjoyment of anything I've ever done is to work with students. I like to see students, when I'm working with a student or a PhD student doing dissertation, I try to see them every day. That keeps them, I think, doing a little bit more and keeps them maybe from floundering around too much and wasting time. So I try to see them every day. And my philosophy of a PhD dissertation is this. I like to tell a student, and I like to do this, that what I'd like to do is for you and I to work together and try to get a paper or two that's publishable. You can't always decide if this is going to be the case or not. And then that would be half to two-thirds of your thesis, and then I'd like to, after that, if we get some results that looks like it could be a joint paper or two, then you go on your own to finish up. Now, it doesn't always work exactly that way, but it works pretty much that way. And probably the fondest memories I have of all teaching is my graduate students, of course, and I hope that, I know that most of you feel the same way, those that are teaching about your students too. I always thought that the finest thing that could be said about anybody is that he or she's a good teacher. Doesn't matter if you're teaching in high school, college, or not a professional teacher, but one of the finest things to say that he or she's a good teacher, no matter how you do it, whether it's a professional or non-professional. I still feel that way, I think.
You get into a little bit about the education aspect of the statistical career. As a graduate student from CSU, I'm always interested in finding out how did you establish this department, being the head of the department and all that. And today we're also almost celebrating the 20th anniversary of this department. Can you give us a little background on how the department was started and how the program was going?
My wife and I had wanted to live in Colorado. When I was, just before I went to the service, my sister lived in Greeley, Colorado, which is about 30 miles from Fort Collins, Colorado. I came out to visit her, and I knew then I wanted to live in Colorado, and so they took me up, my brother-in-law took me up fishing, and they took a picture of me standing along the Big Thompson with a fish line in my hand. I never ever caught a fish there. But I had him take that picture, and I carried that with me all through the war. And when somebody would ask me what I was from or something, I just pulled out that picture and show them I was a fisherman. Big Thompson in the Colorado River. I carried that all through the war with me. But we had wanted to live in Colorado, and yet they offered me this job to come back to Oklahoma State, where I got my master's degree, and I wanted to go back there, actually. When I came through to go back to Oklahoma, I stopped here, and Les Madison, who was chairman of the math department at the time, and Andrew Clark, who was dean of the faculty, which is, I think, later became, the position was called academic vice president. And they interviewed me, and I went on home, and then they wrote me and said they'd give me a job and so forth. And they asked me, my job was to build a graduate program in statistics. So I came here. The math department offered master's degrees, and so I came to Colorado State University in the fall of 1960. Things were easy then. For example, I think the record shows in 1961, I thought, well, there ought to be a stat lab. I was patterning it after Oklahoma State and Iowa State. And so I went to Dean Clark, and I said, I think we ought to have a stat lab. And he said, okay. He said, the State Board of Agriculture is meeting here, I don't know, a day or two. He said, come in and we'll dictate something. So I've still got the letter. He dictated that there should be a stat lab and that I should be in charge of it, head of the stat. And that's how simple things were. They didn't send it through any faculty committees or anything. He just carried it in to the state board, and they approved it. And so we had a stat lab. One of the first things we did was change the name of the department from math to mathematics and statistics, created the stat lab, and then we got a program, PhD program in statistics before they had one in mathematics. And then we had a department, we got a new department. That's when Professor Madison was our head of the department, and he really was the one that helped us tremendously in getting statistics going here. And when he got a new head, when he got retirement age and they got a new head of department, he and the dean wanted statistics to be a separate department. And we really fought hard to keep it from being a separate department. We wanted to be with mathematics and thought maybe computer science. And statistics really started computing on this campus also. But finally we gave up, and they won, and we became a separate department in, as you say, in 1971. And it probably was better. The dean would say, well, I can go with the administration and get money if I have two departments better than if I have one department. But in those days when we first came, it was very hard to hire faculty because there weren't that many departments that were graduating students in statistics. And when I came, we got an NIH grant, and that really helped us get started. And I owe a great deal to Gertrude Cox for that. I'm sure she was the one that pushed us over the edge in getting money for an NIH grant that lasted, I think, a total of 11 years, 10 years with one final year. And that's what I think really helped us get a good start. And the administration that's here said that they would match certain things, and they lived up to every letter that they said they would. One of the other things I did, which I thought was pretty good for us starting out at least, I tried to get every faculty member an appointment in a subject matter department. I thought that was important so that we could get statistics used around the campus. And we did an awful good job in that. We got, in some ways, we did a good job in that. We had some joint efforts with engineers, and we had some joint efforts with psychology. We had some joint appointments with agriculture and several other departments. We thought, as first off, is good for the departments, and we thought it was good for our graduate students to work in these other departments while they were graduate students. So that's pretty much the history. Then, after I stepped down as department head, I think the next department head was Pete Brockwell for just a short time from Australia, and then he went back to Australia. And Jim Williams, I believe, was department head next. And then Dwayne Bays is now department head, and probably be department head next 20 years. I hope he's department head for the next 20 years.
You also have done a lot of international traveling and consulting. Can you share some event with us? Well,
a lot of my traveling wasn't wasn't consulting. It was on our own laboratory.
okay.
We traveled all over the world and stuff. But some of it was, one thing I did have the good fortune, when I started, it was in the summer, I think, in 1964, they had a lot of summer sessions in biostatistics. And I spent one summer, these were 6-week summer sessions. Spent 6 weeks in Yale, which gave me a chance to be in Connecticut. Spent 6 weeks at Berkeley. It gave me a chance to be in the San Francisco area. I spent 6 weeks in Nashville at Vanderbilt, which gave me a chance to be at Nashville. And my son was working on his PhD in Vanderbilt at the time. And, of course, it's close to the Grand Ole Opry. And I spent 6-week session in University of Washington in Seattle. And then I went to UCLA for 1 semester, or 1 quarter actually. And then I did go to Singapore and teach for 2 months. And then I went to South Africa for 6 weeks, and they toured me all over Africa. I lectured all over South Africa. And then I went to Pakistan for between 3 and 4 months. And they wanted to establish a Western-type university there, and they asked me, they sent a chemist, a physicist, a mathematician, and a statistician over to teach in their university in Islamabad, which is right outside of Rawalpindi, and then to make recommendation to the Ford Foundation whether they should support a Western-type university and what kind of university it should be. So we have traveled all over the world a lot, and one of the high points of my life was getting a car and driving the Khyber Pass and going into Afghanistan from Pakistan, and several. We've done a lot. My wife and I have done a lot of traveling like that. Most of the traveling we did outside the United States was not with my work. We did it on our own.
And who did you do your consulting with, primarily?
Well, I used to consult a little bit with the Department of Agriculture, and then I worked for Stand Oil, New Jersey, consulted with them for I don't know, maybe 20 years. Now, what I do, I'd go over once a week and consult with their geologists, and then I would teach a short course for 2 weeks in the summer. And then they moved their labs to Houston, Texas, and so I went down there for many years. I didn't go then do the day-by-day consulting, but I'd go down for 2 weeks and teach. They wanted regression.
Dr. Graybill, about 15 years ago, you, in the presidential address, you had the title saying, "What lies ahead?" Now I'd like to ask the same question. What lies ahead?
Well, for me, I'll be 70 years old in September, so I suppose what lies ahead for me is trying to survive, stay alive.
Survival analysis.
That's right. But they've told me that I can continue on the faculty here, and so I'm going to, as long as my health's good, for a while anyway. I don't know whether statistics is at a crossroad, whether we've gotten a rut now, and whether it seems to me there is a pecking order. Theoretical mathematical statistics seems to be at the top, as it has been for a long time. But there's really a need, as our country, particularly, and the whole world, will get more people, food gets more scarce, we get more resources now. We're maybe in the age of limits, where we're just going to have to limit ourselves. We're going to have to know a lot more about, have a lot more facts about people, what other people are doing, what they're thinking. I think statistics is certainly going to be one of the most important subjects of all. But we're going to have to realize this, I think, as statisticians, and get more students. I don't think you necessarily have to get all PhD students, master's students, or good jobs. Train. One thing we haven't done very successfully in statistics is given bachelor's degrees in statistics, and I think there are place for a bachelor's degree in statistics, but it just seems to haven't caught on. And I think there's really a need for bachelor's students in statistics, and if we would get bachelor's students, get a lot of them, where they could then go into, even if they go into other subjects, somebody with a bachelor's degree in statistics could go in other subjects and do a good job, I think, in helping them get statistics used more and used better, and they'd be good candidates then for our graduate programs. And so I think that's one thing I wish we could do, is get better, more students into undergraduate programs of statistics. There was a time when we had a lot more undergraduate students in statistics than they had in computer science, but now computer science, I presume, way outshines us. I don't know what the figures are for sure. So I would guess that as our country, in this country, we talk about this country for a minute, as we look at productivity, and we have to increase productivity, we have to make better products, statistics has to play a big part in that. There's just no other way. And so, and then pharmaceutical companies, a lot of our students go into pharmaceutical companies, so we need to, we just need to get more students, better students, train them better. I think train them so they want to go into applied work and feel comfortable going in doing applied work and things like that.
What is the most satisfactory event you feel?
Single event in my professional life.
Or you can name several if you want to.
Well, probably the most satisfactory when I got my PhD degree. My parents my mother who had probably 5th grade education, my wife's parents who probably had 5th or 8th grade education came to see me graduate. That was a high point in my life. Of course, nobody in my high school, well, there was one person in my high school, in my grade, went to college and got a bachelor's degree. She got a bachelor's degree. So getting a PhD degree was a high point in my life. And, of course, getting married was kind of a high point in my life, Gene. And 2 children, things like that, as you would expect to be. I think one of the thrills of my life was when my first book was published. That's always a thrill to open it up and see the mistakes. But that was a thrill to me to do that. And of course, one of the most continuing nice things is when some graduate student comes in and said, "I'd like to do my thesis with you." I still enjoy that. When somebody makes me feel good for some reason, I don't know why. When a graduate student comes in and said, "Can I work with you?" I like that. And so those are constant reminders to me of what we should be doing. And I think since Gene and I had always wanted to live in Colorado, I think it was a thrill to me when they wrote and offered me this job in Colorado. And so that was another high point in my life. I wished I could say making this TV tape was a high point in my life, but it makes me nervous.